Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another webinar here from us at UE Systems. Today, we are joined once again by our good friend, Sean Eisenhower with Iridicio. Sean is going to be talking to us all about metrics today. So, are your metrics ridiculous? A look at the problems with most organizational KPIs. So I'm sure this is something that most everybody can relate to within your own organizations, as we're all collecting so much data and have so many sets of goals and things that we're holding ourselves accountable to. So Sean's going to be talking us through how to maybe clean some of those up and really help us be accountable to the right kinds of metrics and KPIs. So this webinar kind of kicks off our next series of complimentary webinars that we're doing with the folks at Iridicio, RDI Technologies, and Fluke Reliability. This was all to do with an effort that we started when COVID first hit, around this Leading Reliability virtual conference that we held back in July. So we did a ton of webinars back in the spring, just to try and provide some content and education while everybody was kind of cooped up at home. And the conference was great. I hope some of you that are on here today maybe even joined us. And so we thought, well, let's do another one. So we are going to hold another Leading Reliability virtual conference. This time it's going to be over 2 days. And we're going to do that to kind of kick off the year, January 13th and 14th. So mark your calendars for that. But in the meantime, we plan to hold webinars like today, leading up to that next conference. So stay tuned for an invite for next week's webinar where Jeff Hay is going to be talking about emotion amplification. So you'll see more information about that from us. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Leading Reliability Conference and how you can access the presentations from the one we did in July and things like that at the end. So just stick with us. And just, kind of a little plug since we're hosting this here, at UE Systems, we continue to want to be a resource for you guys. And I know we're starting to be able to get out a little bit more and actually get face-to-face with our customers, which has been fantastic. I know our guys out in the field have been really happy to be able to get face-to-face with folks once again. But of course, we're still ready and willing to hop on and do virtual training on our software or our equipment, whatever it is you might need some help with. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that you might need as it relates to your ultrasound program, if that's something that you're using. So keep that in mind. And then just some housekeeping before I let Sean take it away. We are recording this just like we record all of our webinars. So we'll have this up on our YouTube page for UE Systems. I'm sure Iridicio will post it somewhere within their video archives as well. And probably we'll find a way to get it on our Leading Reliability website, which again we'll talk about towards the end. But never fear if you have to hop off early or if you really want someone in your organization to hear the message that Sean has today, you'll be able to do that after we're finished. And of course, we definitely welcome questions, so feel free to type those in. I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout, and I'll get those tossed over to Sean as it makes sense throughout his presentation. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And then I don't have this on here, but just as with all things, we are doing this live, so if we experience any technical or audio issues, we'll hop on fixing those as quick as we can. And I know I'm doing this from home and I'm not alone. So if you hear dogs barking or children screaming, just, ignore them. I'm sure they'll be fine. So with that, Sean, I'm going to turn the screen over to you and we will let you take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you much, Maureen. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I am going to go ahead and go full screen with this. Give me just a second. And as luck would have it, we'll flip them around. All right. So ready to talk about key performance indicators, or as we here in the US refer to them a lot of times, metrics. This is a subject that I think probably evokes more passion than just about any other subject that I deal with on a regular basis, because just about everybody has a story like the picture that you see on the screen right now. great looking key performance indicators, great looking metrics, and then you see the rest of the story back there in the back. And it really got me thinking, what all goes into making really bad metrics? And so that's where we're going to spend the time today. Honestly, when I started thinking about all the different ways over the years that I've seen metrics and KPIs done poorly, I realized I probably had enough content for 3 or 4 of these. So bear with me. We're going to cover quite a bit of material, but I think you'll resonate with some of it. I think some of it will probably make you mad. So with that said, welcome to the first webinar that ever made you mad since COVID started. So we're going to talk about these questions, and I'm going to kind of dive down into them, but I want to ask you guys these questions. So do you have too many metrics or KPIs? Are your metrics so old and crusty that you could find them just stuffed in a corner somewhere with no one really paying attention? Do they paint a rosy picture of a thorny situation? Do your KPIs drive unintended behaviors? Are they really doing what you want them to do? Do you know where they are and where they should be? Do you have a cheater in your house? So we're going to answer and talk about some of these questions. I'm sure all of you know a metrics cheater. And so we're going to take a look at those folks as we dive into today's session. So if you could really boil it down to some key points, this is where I'm going to stick today. We're going to talk about metric misapplication, and this is all about the selection process for metrics. We're going to talk about balancing your metrics and aligning them with corporate goals. We're going to talk about cascading them from the top to the bottom, and one of the key points here is the metrics at the top are not necessarily the same metrics at the bottom. We're going to talk about process-driven metrics, and I'll show you a few things that I think will help with that perspective. We're going to talk about dynamic KPIs and why your key performance indicators or your metrics should be dynamic. We're going to talk about metrics madness, and this is for those of you who have way too many metrics because somebody said, hey, the CMMS can measure this, so why don't we? The next thing we're going to talk about is the unintentional consequences that you heard about in the previous slide. And the last thing we're going to talk about is how do you gut check? How do you make sure you don't have metrics cheaters in your organization? So with that said, I want to be clear, as much as I'm going to hate on metrics today, and believe me, I'm going to hate on them a lot. But at the end of the day, this presentation isn't meant to say that metrics are bad. We all know that we have to measure it. We all know what gets measured gets improved. So this isn't meant to be, an excuse for not measuring metrics. There are some very good metrics out there that give us some really good transparency into the organization, especially when they're used in combination with other points. And one of those that we see very often is one called OEE, or Overall Equipment Effectiveness. Now, I pulled this graphic from a book, and I will try to give you resources or sources for all of the graphics and things that I give today, but this one came from a book called Making Common Sense Common Practice by Ron Moore. And in here, his point with this slide is that in his facilities where he did his study, as OEE increased, overall equipment effectiveness increased, the safety rate got better, or the safety failure rate got lower. So well, you can see that from the graphic. You can even see where there was a nice bump in OEE there in quarter 12, and you can see that bump in OEE corresponds to that dip down there in the safety rate. So we were getting safer as the OEE went up. So again, this is not meant to sit up here and say you shouldn't have metrics. You absolutely should. All I'm suggesting is I'm going to poke a little bit of fun at all the ways we do it wrong. Now, I pulled this graphic out of the archives, and I mean, I had to go way back for this one. This came from a company called Alcoa, and an individual by the name of Vince Adorno. And he was talking about how if he measured the success of the reliability and maintenance programs in his organization, and he could move them from a 300, as this scale is set up, to that 750 range, what he saw was that he could reduce his MRO spend by 23%, and he could reduce his contractor labor and overtime costs by 31%. And so this became something they were able to demonstrate over and over as they brought various plants through the reliability journey. And it really reinforced what you see here. So again, I'm not negative on the metric. I just don't want to see this. How many of you have a dashboard for your metrics that looks like this one? In fact, everything in your CMMS that you can measure, you are measuring, and then you throw in a few other corporate metrics and some things on top. I have been in a ton of plants recently where it seems like the number of metrics that they're addressing is just over the top. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts on how many you can actively manage at one time. But I can tell you it's going to look a lot more like this and a lot less like that. So we're going to dive into this, and I'm going to talk about how you manage them and what some of those important things are moving forward. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of metrics that are out there. And I've got a couple ideas that I'll kind of put forth today. One of them I may have named. The rest of them I think you'll see are pretty aptly named to exactly what they are. But the three classifications for metrics that I believe are out there, and this becomes really important in a second, is the holy metrics. And I call them holy metrics because, as you can see on the stones right there on the screen, they were delivered down from high, and by God, you better track them, because if you don't, you're going to get a note in your file. So these are those mandated corporate metrics that we track. Now, I'm not suggesting that holy metrics are all bad. But what I will tell you is a lot of times holy metrics are tied back to compensation plans. And when that happens, my belief is that those metrics no longer hold a lot of the value that they once did. I'm going to talk about that a little more because that's probably a little upsetting for some folks. But holy metrics, again, are those corporate mandated metrics. Now, the next set of metrics are the results metrics. These are things that you do because you want to. They show what you're working on. They show what you're doing. They're justification for the project, or their justification for something you want to do moving forward. They're very result driven. The last set of metrics that we're going to talk about are behavioral metrics. And you measure these because you need to, not because you want to, or not because someone told you you had to. You measure these because you need to in order to drive change. And when I get into especially the process-driven metrics section that we'll talk about a little later, I'm going to be talking about a lot of true behavioral metrics. So let's talk a little more about the holy or Hokie. You kind of got to wonder, if you have those holy metrics out there and they're tied to that performance pay and people are cheating and you know they are, then they become pretty hokey. In fact, I would say they hold very little value to you as someone who's trying to make change in the organization. Now, I know that again, this is probably a little bit shocking to hear me say, but at the end of the day, I know they're good metrics. I know they have good intent, but when they're put in that holy realm, a lot of times the data gets messed with, it gets played with, it gets monkeyed with. And so at the end of the day, if all your metrics look good, if all your holy metrics look good, but you're still not performing at the level that you should be, then I would suggest we've got some hokey metrics going on. Now, the second part of this, after we talked about the holy and hokey, is the behavioral versus the results driven. And if you think about it, those are really leading versus lagging. The only reason I refer to them a little differently is that leading and lagging indicators change depending on where you are in the organization. They don't always stay the same. There are a few that will, but in general, things can go back and forth on this list depending on your level or how you're looking at the situation. But I've put a few leading indicators on here, things like schedule compliance. You know what, if I'm compliant to my schedule, there's a good chance that my reliability is going to go up. So that's a leading indicator. Now we've got some lagging indicators, things like stockouts. Oh, I'm measuring how many times I didn't have the materials I needed to do the job. So that's a lagging indicator. So leading and lagging indicators, again, you'll hear that phrase or that terminology quite a bit. In fact, you'll see it as part of the SMRP body of knowledge. And in doing that, just remember, one is a result and the other drives a behavior. Now, the next piece that I wanted to talk about to kind of talk about these bad, ridiculous metrics is when you have a metric scorecard that's not balanced. It doesn't reflect everything that's going on in your organization. If you say health and safety is important, then there should be a metric associated with that. If you say employee welfare is important, then there should be a metric associated with that. Of course, at the right level in the organization, the level that can use that metric to actually drive change, but it has to be reflected. The scorecard needs to be balanced. A lot of times I see very limited scorecards that are very focused on just one piece of the business. And that's probably not the best choice, because you can do some things with those metrics that specifically drive down employee welfare, that specifically harm health and safety. So you want to balance your scorecard, taking into account all of those facets. Now, the second part of balancing your scorecard is having those leading and lagging indicators I just talked about. You don't want just lagging indicators in your area, because all that's going to do is basically put you in a situation where you're steering a boat down the lake, but you're looking at the wake. You can't see anything in front of you. You can only see where you've been. And so we want to make sure that we've got a balance of leading that are going to drive the behaviors that we want, and then lagging to see that we're getting the results that we expected. So one way to think about that, or the next thing that I really want to focus on, and it's in that same idea of balancing your network or balancing your metrics, and that is looking at your goals. What is the organization's goals moving forward? If growth is one of your goals, then you may need to control cost. If you need to control cost, you may need to improve reliability, or you may need to get the right materials in stores so that you can maintain your assets at the lowest cost. You may want to make sure that you plan your jobs, because you know that planned job is going to be much more efficient and more effective to execute. Again, controlling cost and allowing for the organization to grow. So as you think about your measurements or your KPIs, you're thinking about how do they drive those key levers which drive the initiative or the corporate direction that you're headed. So this is just an example of a cascade of those metrics, but the point here is what I'm measuring at the C level may not be what I'm measuring at the floor, but what I'm measuring at the floor drives the results that will get us to those metrics that the C level is looking for. This is just an example of a scorecard. It's got your months across the top. It's got your metrics down the side, all the things that you want to address from that perspective. You probably have your own style. I showed you some of the graphic styled ones a little earlier. Those are also a really good way to be able to show more than just the number. It really shows trends. It can show more of the patterns that we're seeing and that sort of thing. Now, before we leave cascading metrics, and before we leave, well, I mean, and even as we leave cascading metrics, I want to talk a little bit about one of the big problems I see with metrics, and that's this idea that if I watch these two metrics, I can tell you what's going on in my department, or I can tell you what's going on in my business. And I see that over and over, where people grab on or they gravitate toward a couple of metrics and they drag them through their whole career. And I think a really good example of why this doesn't work is a movie that came out in 2003 called Moneyball. The book came out in 2003. The movie came out in 2011. And in that book and movie, what you learn is that this individual, Billy Beane, actually went in and started measuring different metrics. He went against what all of the other recruiters or the scouts had done in the past. And because of that, he built a much more successful team than he would have been capable of doing any other way. But When these other recruiters found out what he was doing and how he was doing it, they thought it was crazy because they had held so tightly the metrics that they had measured for so many years. And so this, I think, is a good example of a question that I would ask you. Are you holding on to some metrics that really aren't driving any value anymore? They don't fit in the new environment. Here's an example. I'll ask you a question. How reliable is this plant? Now you can see percentage of the assets that are running is 91%. It's in the green. And you can see that their total maintenance cost is also in the green. Does that mean they're reliable? But yet a lot of us would use these two metrics to measure the performance. So my thoughts for you is, yes, I mean, this does give us an indication of where it's headed, but it doesn't tell us definitively if this is a reliable plant. In fact, let me paint a little more of the picture. What if the asset utilization is 78%? The mean time between failure is 50%. It's down there in the red. And the maintenance cost is still in the green, but they're doing very little proactive work. So in this scenario, we may see marginally good asset utilization and the maintenance cost is great, but in reality, because of the mean time between failure and because of the lack of proactive work, it tells us very quickly that we're consuming the assets in that facility. We are not building for the future. We're taking out of the future. So taking metrics and putting them together in groups can be a lot more telling from that perspective. Here's another example. Would you say this facility has a bright future? Take a look. Asset utilization is creeping into the green. Mean time between failure is high yellow, almost in the green. Maintenance cost is a little high, but they're doing a lot of proactive work. So when you look at those four metrics again together, it paints a really good picture. It tells me likely they are in the process of implementing reliability improvements in that organization. Because of that, there's a bow wake. There's going to be the finding of all the failures out there that you didn't know existed. There's going to be getting people involved in remapping processes and re-engineering those. You know, there's going to be lots of work that happens, and that's going to drive cost up. There's always going to be a bump, a bow wake, an increase in cost. But we can also see at the same time, the mean time between failure is getting better and better. That asset utilization is in the green, and those proactive work measurements are also in the green. So it tells us that likely this facility has a bright future. Now, this next graphic, and those of you that know me, you've seen this slide before. I use this slide a lot, but I think it especially holds true for this metrics discussion. Many times people are living in the danger zone when it comes to metrics. They don't know where the information's coming from. They don't know how it's calculated, but somebody told them they should measure it. And while they're measuring it, they probably ought to beat people upon the head and neck with it. That's the struggle. That's the issue I see with some of the metrics. If you don't know enough about where the data is coming from and what the situation was behind it, if you're not over in that expert zone, then you could find yourself very well entrenched in that danger zone that you see there. And that's not good for anyone. Now, let's talk a little bit about process-driven metrics. And process-driven metrics, in this section, this is, I think, one of the most important takeaways from this presentation, and I think it's also one of the most neglected things that I see when it comes to metrics. A lot of people love to go buy a book, and there are a lot of great books on metrics out there that you can pull these metrics from. A lot of people like to go download the SMRP metrics compendium and look through their definitions and their metrics and pick from that list. And at the end of the day, those are all good, but it may not be the right metric for you. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So what I've tried to show here on the screen today is two processes, a current or an as-is process, and then what we also call a target or a future state process. And if you've ever gone through business process reengineering, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. But if this is something new to you, I'll spend a little bit of time with it. So what we're doing is we're basically sitting down with a cross-functional group and we're suggesting to them, hey, tell me how you get work done in this organization. And this could be at the macro level, where we're looking at the fact that you request work and a work gets approved. And once it gets approved, it gets planned. And once it gets planned, it gets scheduled, and so forth and so on. But you're sitting down with that group and talking about all the different ways that they do it. And what you'll see inevitably is that you'll make one run through, it'll go pretty easy, and then everybody thinks they're done with it. And then you go back and you start looking at them and you look at that guy who's from that other department and you say, is this exactly how you do it every time? And the answer you'll hear is, well, no, we don't do it like that. We do it a little different. And what happens as you go through that editing of that process map, you start to see these parallel paths, other ways of doing things. You start to see ways of skipping steps. You start to see ways of just losing whatever it is. It goes into a black hole because there's no connection. And I tried to show a few of those on this graphic. Now, what I will tell you, in real life, when you map these business processes out with Post-it notes, it'll be a lot more complex than what you see on the screen. But if you look there at the very beginning, what I'm trying to show is all the different ways that work could come into the system. And it could be phone calls, it could be emails, it could be face-to-face conversation in the plant. It could be lots of different things that become the input for your work execution process. And that's what I tried to model here. Now, the next thing you see, it moves from that box into the next box, and then you've got a red box below it. And that red box is where someone puts a work request in and you decide you're not going to do it. Now, you're not going to do it because you know that that piece of equipment's getting ready to be replaced, or that pump skid is getting ready to be pulled out and a new one's going to be put in, or we're not spending any more money on that one because it's slated to be retired. Whatever the case may be, you have a real reason for getting rid of that work. But what you see here is a broken link. You see it leaving that box and never getting fed back. And this represents where that work order is closed, or that work request is closed, and no feedback is given to the operator or the requester, whoever that may be. And that represents a way that that operator is basically going to stop supporting your process, because they're going to put a work request in. Nothing's going to happen. They're going to put that same work request in a second time and nothing is going to happen. They're probably not going to put it in a third time. So that is a bad box, and I coded it red because that's something I want to go away. It's not so much that I want the ability to cancel the work request to go away, but I want to fix that broken link so that they get the feedback for why it was canceled. Now, some of the other boxes you see, they bypass steps. Maybe I don't like the work approval process. I don't like the fact that when I put in a work request and it gets approved, or it gets selected and then goes through the approval process, I don't always get through, or it doesn't get done fast enough, or it doesn't get coded as an emergency. It gets coded as corrective work for the future. I don't like that. So to get around it, I've got my own process. I go talk to one of the supervisors. I tell him that I want this done, and it just happens because we are good buddies. We play golf together on the weekends. So that process is represented by the yellow and the blue up there at the top. Now, I couldn't code golf bad, so I left it blue. But at the end of the day, it is a bypass. It is not going through our standard process moving forward. Now, you also see another bypass a little further along. And again, I just wanted to represent what you typically see. Now, this will become in real life an absolute mess. There will be Post-it notes everywhere, all over your butcher block paper. There's lines connecting them everywhere. It's crazy what all's going on from that perspective. So we want to create a good future state process. And the best way to create a future state process is to bring the good stuff from up above down below and put it in the right order and clean it up and get it the way it needs to be so that we have one process for everyone. And I'm showing it as a linear process, but of course it may have yeses and nos and a few loops in it, and that's completely acceptable, but it needs to be clear to people what happens next in the process as you go forward. And so you can see this is very linear. I know exactly what happens next in each box. Now the change between the current and the target state is represented by those blue triangles. That's the delta. That is the difference. That is the fact that I got rid of those bypasses. That is the fact that I got rid of those broken links. And because I got rid of them, I'm driving those dollar signs out the bottom down there. That's the improvement that I'm getting. Now, a lot of people get this and they go through and they map their current states and understand where all the bad stuff is, and they clean it out and they make their target states. But then they just roll those target states out to the organization. What I'm suggesting to you today is that if you're using process-driven metrics, those deltas that you see there, those changes from the current state to the target state, those should be some of your metrics. Now, they're a unique set of metrics, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But at the end of the day, if you want to change, if you want to get people to stop doing it the old way, you're going to have to measure it. You're going to have to keep your eye on it, because if you don't, the target process will slide right back into the current process and look just like it did before. So how do we do that? How do we use process-driven metrics? Well, let's take a look. My belief, and I said that they're metric monsters, these people who create hundreds and hundreds of metrics, and I can't focus on all these metrics. In fact, my rule of thumb is that any level the organization can't focus on more than 10 metrics at one time. Now, I'm not suggesting with the CMMS and EAMs that we have today, enterprise asset management systems that we have today, I'm not suggesting that you can't track more than 10. I get that. What I'm saying is any level can only focus on 10. So if you believe what I'm saying, then you have 10 metrics. Now you know that 4 of them are going to be holy metrics. Thou shalt track this metric. It came down from on high, on stone, we must do it. So that takes away some of our metrics. That leaves 6 metrics that we can look at locally. All right? What I'm suggesting to you today is in that 6 metrics that we look at locally, 5 of them could change regularly. And these are just rules of thumb. I mean, if it's 3, 4, whatever, if it's all 6, that's fine. But 5 of them should be changing regularly. Now, why should they change regularly? They change regularly because they flatline over time. The organization eventually either gets to the performance that that metric is trying to drive, or settles out at the level that it's capable of delivering with the processes it has today. So in that case, those 5 that change regularly allow us to freshen those metrics up, to knock the cobwebs off of them, to put something in there that addresses one of those deltas that we saw in that previous slide. So if in a perfect world I could have what I want, 10 metrics I'm monitoring at each level of the organization, 4 of them come down from on high, they cascade, they do all the right things, 5 of them change regularly. Of those 6 metrics, 3 of them really ought to measure changes I'm trying to make in the process. So if I want to get rid of that broken link where the operators and requesters weren't getting feedback on their canceled work request, then I might make that a metric. I know that's a weird metric, but it's a metric that works to change that behavior until that goes away, and then I can move on to the next metric. So if your metrics are the same metrics you had last year, and your metrics are the same metrics you had the year before, then I would suggest some of your metrics are ridiculous. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, and again, this is still on that idea of change and the fact that those metrics are going to change over time. What you see here is a look at a journey, and we're headed toward that that reliability future that we want to get to. And you see, early on the road here, we've got vision, we've got mission, we've got goals. Those are things that we have to do in order to get started. We've got to have governing principles. And then you move a little further along and you see things like we're now doing kitting and root cause analysis and planning and scheduling. And then you move a little further and you start to collect more and more data out of your enterprise asset management system or your CMMS, computerized maintenance management system. So you start making more decisions using that data. Maybe you're zero-based budgeting. Maybe you're modeling using RAM modeling. All right, so all of those things start coming into play. And then you realize, man, we are making great progress. We've kind of got the maintenance house in order. We need to get operations more engaged. So you see things like TPM and operator care as you get further along. And then the data gets even better and you see reliability statistics and asset management and all of those things. But you can see there is a progression. Over time, you move to different areas of focus. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody goes through the same road or follows the same path. In fact, it's quite contrary to that. In reality, what I see is everybody kind of has their own path based on where they are currently in each of these areas. So the path changes a little bit and you have a master plan that helps you figure that out and drive your way through it. And many of those that have seen my presentations before know that I think a master plan is absolutely critical to organizational success, especially with these big deal change initiatives. So with that said, though, my point for showing this graphic today is your metrics have to change. They have to follow this path. I'm not going to measure kitting in day one. And I'm probably not going to measure kitting at 3 years because it's going to become so normal. It's just part of what we expect here. I'm going to be measuring things like operator care and return on assets because I'm further down the path. So key point, your metrics will change as time goes on. All right, so let's take a look at one more section. And this is the section about really verifying what is happening with your metrics. Now, over the years, I've had the pleasure of doing a lot of maintenance and reliability assessments. In fact, I think I've done assessments on 6 out of 7 continents. So over the years, I've come in, I've got to look at where they were and what they were doing. And there's some things that I continue to see happen over and over and over. And a lot of it was the things we're talking about today. Poorly chosen metrics, metrics that drive bad behaviors, metrics that are just out and out lies, all of those things coming into play. So I and another one of my peers started thinking about how does this all relate together? How does this all fit? And we took a set of harmonized metrics from the Society of Maintenance and Reliability Professionals, SMRP. These happen to be a set of metrics that they harmonized with the European Federation of National Maintenance Societies. So these metrics specifically are not better than the other metrics. They're the metrics that have been harmonized. There are lots of other metrics that you could use. There's no specialness other than that. But with that said, we knew that these metrics could be standardized and used both in the US as well as abroad. So we started looking at these metrics and started thinking about how do they work together? And you see that results and behavior popping up again. You see where we looked at these metrics and we said, well, that drives a result or that drives a behavior. And you'll notice there are a lot more of these that were results of the work that was happening, and a lot less of them were behaviors. Now, the other thing we tried to do, and this gets a little bit tough, but the other thing we tried to do is to assign a target direction for each of these metrics. So do I want it to go up or down in my organization? An example of that would be maintenance cost as a percentage of replacement asset value. That's the first one you see there. So maintenance cost as a percentage of replacement asset value, typically I want to drive down. Now that doesn't hold for every organization because if you're underspending and you drive it down, it's only going to get worse. So again, these are it's a typical target direction. So again, you see inventory turns. That's how many times has this part been used over the last year. Typically, I want my inventory turns to go up, because if it goes up, that means I'm using the parts in the storeroom and I don't have a whole lot of parts there that are just sitting on the shelf. Now, don't get me wrong, I get the fact that some of you are going, yeah, but if I'm using it, I'm not very reliable, which is entirely true. But if you're not using it, it's just sitting there as a really expensive insurance policy. So you can see those target directions, you can see those results and behaviors, and now you can start to see our thoughts based on the SMRP definitions, our thoughts of where they should go in order to drive the other metric in the correct direction. For instance, if I want maintenance cost as a percentage of replacement asset value to go down the target direction, then I want my overtime to be trending toward 12%. I want my preventive maintenance work to be trending toward 15%. I want my condition-based maintenance or PDM work to be trending toward 15% of the labor hours available for work. Proactive work, a metric we saw earlier, I want it trending toward 80%. Reactive work, I can't tell you where I want it to go because I don't know where it is, but what I can tell you is I want it to go down. I want less reactive work. And I could carry out across the whole entire matrix. But my point here is, as you look across there, you can see what should be happening. So if you're assessing a facility or you're assessing your plant and you see that your maintenance cost as a percentage of replacement asset value is going down, which is where it should be going, but you don't see all of those other things going across, going the direction that they are indicated, then I would suggest you have a metrics cheater in your midst. And you can do that same thing with each of them as you go down the chart. So this became what I realized was going on inside my head while I was doing assessments. Because when I do an assessment for a facility, the first thing I look at are the metrics, because they send those to you out in advance and you take a look. That begins you thinking about these things. So you say, okay, well, their maintenance unit cost is going down, so I should expect to see 15% of their work is condition-based maintenance or PDM. I should see that schedule compliance is going up, is trending up. And if I don't see those things, then I have to second guess what that number really means and who's manipulating it. So this was our attempt at taking what we do during an assessment and boiling it down into a sheet that you could use to really see where you may be missing something or cheating something in your organization. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about, and everybody knows that just like planning and scheduling is very important to me, and just like, you know, having good work processes is very important, I, of course, also love root cause analysis. And I can't have a presentation without some mention of it. But with that said, if you can't do root cause analysis on your metrics, I would suggest that the metric is, again, ridiculous. And what I mean by that is a lot of times the metric is really the highest point in the fault tree. It's really not, it doesn't tell you what's actually going on. It just tells you that there is an issue. You've got to drill down and understand how that metric was calculated. You got to drill down into what was driving those numbers and that data. That's where you're going to find the solutions that you can put in place. And as you've heard me say many times before, at the end of the day, don't stop at the physical and human. Get all the way down into those systemic and latent, those organizational issues. What is causing this metric to go the wrong way? Deep down at the root causes. So with that said, we've talked about a lot today. I've tried to kind of give you guys a look at a lot of the things that I think make the metrics that we're using absolutely ridiculous. The first thing, of course, is using the wrong metric. And this could be because you don't understand what it's doing or what it's driving, Or it could be that you don't understand the unintentional consequences of using it. You start measuring how big your storeroom is, and everybody starts trying to drive down the storeroom, but they haven't fixed the other issues. So now your reliability goes the wrong direction. You become less reliable because you don't have the parts to deal with your situation. Now, I know that's a gross oversimplification, but that is a perfect example of where one metric is being driven in a positive direction, quote unquote positive, but it is actually causing the organization to perform less well. KPI balancing. I talked about making sure that your metrics and KPIs are aligned with your corporate goals. Making sure that if you say safety is #1 priority, there should be a metric there for safety that is cascading down through the organization. It may not look like the same metric that is measured at the corporate level, but it is definitely driving that safety performance component of the mission and vision of the organization. And then cascading. And cascading, again, as we talked about, is making sure that the metrics at the bottom are not the same as the metrics at the top. The metrics are meaningful to the level of the organization that they're being applied to, and they're driving the right behaviors. We talked about process-driven metrics, and process-driven metrics, I think, are one of the things, again, that I said earlier that are absolutely critical to have into your metric scorecard. And these change on a regular basis, but they are there to drive specific behaviors to help you get from the current process that you're in to the target process that you want to reside in the future. Make sure they're dynamic. Make sure your metrics are changing. Change them every 4, 5, 6 months. Change them when they flatline. Change them when you're no longer getting value. Think about the value of each of the metrics that you're measuring. Metrics madness. This is that opening slide where you saw all of those metrics just all over the screen. And in this one, I want to cut them all the way back to 10. I realize there'll be some holy metrics in there, and I know those have to be there, but I want to use the rest of those metrics to be dynamic. I want to use the rest of those metrics to be process driven, and I want to use the rest of those metrics to make sure they're balanced with the organizational goals. Make sure you're really considering the unintentional consequences. I think every time we put a metric in, we ought to sit down and say, okay, if they do this, what could go wrong? Think of it as a risk analysis. Think about, okay, if we change this piece, or if we measure this, what could go wrong? Sometimes people put downtime in as one of their metrics, and they think, well, reducing downtime, that's a great idea. But at the end of the day, if that means that what's happening is your maintenance guys are now standing next to the equipment so they can hit the reset button on the PLC to get it back up and running faster than anybody in the history of the world, that'll reduce your downtime, but it's not going to fix your problem. Because now you're going to be spending more on maintenance. You're not going to have the resources to do what you need because they're out on the floor. And because you don't have the resources, you won't get your preventive maintenance done. You won't get your condition-based maintenance done. And eventually, you'll start to see the reliability begin to fail. And then the last thing I talked about is that gut check review. Take the time to ask yourself the 2 questions. 1, if this metric is going up, what metric should be going down? And 2, if this metric is bad, what caused this metric to be bad? If I drill down into it, what are the issues, the underlying issues that actually allow this metric to take the direction that it's headed? If you're putting a metric out and you're not willing or ready to explain what's happening and why it's happening, then I would suggest that metric is absolutely ridiculous. With that said, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. We will take some questions if there are any. If you want to ask me questions offline, my email address is here on the screen. That's also my cell phone. You're welcome to text me and we can chat more and more about metrics. If you think the stuff I talked about today was absolute hogwash, let's chat. Give me a call, reach out, let's talk a little bit, because I enjoy this stuff. I learn every day as I spend more and more times looking at it, and you know, we'll learn from each other as we talk through each of these issues. So don't feel like that there's any reason you can't reach out and have a good conversation about the metrics that you have in your organization and what you may be able to do to make them a whole lot less ridiculous. thanks again. I've enjoyed it, and I hope to answer some of your questions.
Awesome. Okay, good stuff, Sean. So let's see here. Someone is asking, what is the right way to track mean time between failure as a KPI? Should it be asset-wise or plant-wise
Oh my.
or
All right, well,
other?
this is an interesting one. You know, there's actually a website called nomtbf.com. You might want to check that out for whoever asked the question. It's a very good read. And it won't necessarily change what you're doing, but it may change your perspective on some things. The correct answer to your question is there's not a really good answer. I don't track MTBF necessarily at the plant level if I have an option or a choice, because there's lots of things that can pull that around and direct it. I'm going to track it at the asset level, or more specifically, probably the asset class level. That's going to be where I'm going to focus most readily, but I'm going to take the time to look at that note MTBF sign or site to really see the details of why you may not want to use just that metric.
All right. Here's one, a little bit lengthy here, but so Sean, what has been your experience for how long it takes a site that has been doing the right things and then management begins harvesting their success instead of reinvesting and continuing the improvement trend? How long will it take for the site's performance to begin deteriorating? 18 months? Question.
I've seen this over and over, Maureen. It's real. You work really hard. You put predictive maintenance in place. You put condition monitoring in place. You put planning, and you put scheduling, and you get kitting, and you do all the right things. And just when you really start to hit the stride, they're like, well, we're pretty reliable. It's good enough. Let's get rid of the planners. Or we're pretty reliable. It's good enough. We don't need those condition monitoring technicians anymore. So it hurts. It's painful. Now, how long it takes to see that pain varies a little bit from site to site and environment to environment. But I would suggest to you that in 12 months, you're going to see the effects of that. And the reason I say 12 months, it depends on how good you were. If you had a lot of things really, really running well, it will take time for that flywheel to start spinning back down. Now, if you were just really hitting your stride and you didn't have a lot of energy in that flywheel yet, then you're going to see it a lot quicker, because that flywheel is going to it's going to tap out in 2, 3, 4 months, and you're going to see yourself starting to slide back the other way. So think of the flywheel analogy when you think of this question. If it's early on, it won't take long before you're going to see the bad habits starting to cost you. If you're further along and you've really put a lot of energy into that flywheel, it will spin a little longer, and it will take a little longer to see all those ill effects.
All right, here's a great one. How do you ensure metrics and targets make sense when KPIs are trying to be defined for multiple sites of the same organization, but those sites have different needs?
Oh man, I didn't talk about this one, but I was actually talking with one of my friends and also cohorts here at Iridicio, Rick Clonan, this morning, and we talked about this very subject. And you're in a tough spot, and that's the best way I can say it, because I think metrics are personal. I think they're personal to the site. I have to be real careful, because obviously there are benchmarks and there are standards that we shoot for. But if your business isn't the same as somebody else, if you make a different product, or you deliver a different flavor, or maybe yours changes over more often, that's going to affect the metric. One of the ones that falls into this category that drives me nuts is this idea of wrench time. Everybody wants to compare their wrench time, and they want to compare across multiple facilities. In fact, I have a blog post on this from a few years back, where I just don't think you can use that metric across multiple sites, because there's so many things that make the numbers, the data, different, that they're just not that comparable. So what Rick and I talked about this morning was, at the end of the day, it comes down to the delta. You take the number, you measure the number the way you measure it with the data you have, and you try to improve it every single month. So you want to go after the delta, not the number. Now, if I want to compare deltas, that might be a little more fun across the sites, but just comparing the numbers and not knowing how they calculated them becomes very tough. And I know I just made some corporate people a little upset.
All right, cool. And then one last one, because I think this would benefit probably a lot of people on the call. Someone, because you mentioned SMRP and the CMRP a few times, maybe you could just throw out a few kind of resources that you think are helpful for those that are wanting to dive into getting their CMRP certification.
Absolutely. So there is definitely some great resources up on the SMRP site. If you are a member, you've got access to their metrics, and their metrics isn't just a list of equations. It actually explains what goes into the metric, how it's calculated, what other data you need. Those can be great resources to kind of help study as you're going into the CMRP. There are other resources available for the CMRP, everything from um, uh, BOK reference books and modules to BOK body of knowledge training that you can get. We offer a body of knowledge class ourselves. It's been one of our more popular classes that can help you work through and get ready for that exam. It's not there really isn't a way you can just go and sit through a book or sit through a class. It's based on experience. But if you take the time to get in there and dive in and review the topics, it can certainly help you as you think about what is in those 5 pillars of the body of knowledge.
Awesome. Okay, and Sean had his contact info up there for a while, so hopefully those of you that had some additional questions and discussion topics, you guys can reach out to him directly. If you missed it, certainly you can reach out to me. I know how to get you in touch with Sean, and we'll be sure you get your questions answered. So thanks again, Sean. Before we let everybody run for today, just another reminder, if you go to leadingreliability.com, it's a great website where you can actually access all the presentations that we did at our first virtual conference back in July. Again, it was with our friends at Eruditio, RDI Technologies, Fluke Reliability, and of course, us here at UE Systems. Be on the lookout for the webinar invite for next week. We've got at least 3 more webinars scheduled as we get into October. And I'm sure we'll be doing even more as we get towards the end of the year. But of course, January 13 to 14 of 2021, which will hopefully be a better year for all, we're going to be doing another virtual conference. So I hope everybody enjoyed what Sean had to say today. Hope you guys learned a lot. Again, we did record this, so we'll have it up on our YouTube channel here probably hopefully later today. So you can always check that out. Just go to YouTube and search UE Systems. And with that, I'll put our contact info up here. So certainly reach out, any questions, anything you guys need, suggestions for future webinar topics, anything and everything. We're happy to take some suggestions and certainly chat with you. We miss people. So definitely reach out and don't be a stranger. But again, Sean, thank you, and hope everybody has a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and we'll catch you guys later.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.